There is something you did not say at dinner tonight. Not because you forgot. Not because you couldn't find the words. Because you looked across the table and understood, in the way you understand things before language catches up, that saying it would not have helped. So the dinner ended with handshakes, or with a hug that was a half-second shorter than usual, or with the particular kind of eye contact that means, we are done for tonight, not done forever. You drove home. The radio was on. You were not listening to it. You kept replaying the moment, not the thing that was said, the thing underneath it, the disagreement that lived below everything you agreed to. Both sides gave a little. Both sides moved forward. Both sides knew before the handshake that the actual thing, the real thing, the thing at the bottom of the argument that never surfaces, was not touched. The streetlights passed one by one. The food smell was still on your jacket. You drove. Some agreements are about truth. Some are about exhaustion. You have always known the difference. My name is Nathan. Former high school history teacher, Evansville, Indiana. 12 years at a Catholic school teaching world history and early Christianity. I resigned when the evidence kept leading me somewhere the institution was not prepared to follow. I want to tell you about a verse. There is one passage in the entire New Testament where one apostle calls another apostle a hypocrite to his face. In public. On the record. In a document that Paul wrote before any gospel existed. The verse has been in every Bible for 2,000 years. Most Christians have never read it carefully. It is Galatians chapter 2 verse 11. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. That is Paul writing. In his own hand. Approximately 49 to 50 of the Common Era. Before Mark, before Matthew, before Luke, before John. The Greek word behind stood condemned is kataginoskein. It does not mean, I thought he was making a mistake. It does not mean, I respectfully disagreed with his theological position. It means judged, found guilty, the word used for a legal verdict, a verdict announced in front of witnesses. And 2 verses later, Paul uses the word hypocrite. Hypocrisy. He acted hypocritically. He was playing both sides. Paul did not argue with Peter, he convicted him. Now understand what that means in terms of who these people are. Peter, at this moment, is not simply a leader among equals. He is the man who walked with Jesus for 3 years, who was present at the Transfiguration, who was at Gethsemane, who, according to Matthew 16 verse 18, was told directly, "On this rock I will build my church." 2,000 years of Catholic tradition traces the authority of the papacy to that verse, to that man. And Paul calls him a hypocrite in Antioch, in public, in writing, in a document addressed to a community of people who were there and would know if he was exaggerating. You have been told your whole life that the church was founded by men who agreed, that the early movement was unified by the Spirit, that disagreements dissolved in prayer, that the faith that came out of the first century was coherent, intentional, and built on shared mission. That is the stained glass version. And somewhere before you had the scholarship to say why, you never entirely believed it. Not because you were faithless, because you were paying attention. You felt in the way you feel things before the evidence arrives that something underneath the official story did not resolve. That 2 men this different, this committed to incompatible visions, do not end up as co-founders of the same institution unless someone buried what actually happened between them. You felt the crack. Now, you have the text. Galatians 2 verse 11. In every Bible you have ever owned. In Paul's own handwriting. Addressed to a community that was there and remembered. Now let me show you what the book of Acts does with this confrontation. Acts chapter 15. The Jerusalem Council. Luke, writing approximately 40 years after the events he is describing, presents the Jerusalem Council of approximately 48 of the Common Era as a model of early Christian governance. Paul and Barnabas travel up from Antioch. There is debate. Peter speaks first and endorses the Gentile mission. Paul and Barnabas testify about signs and wonders. James gives a ruling. A formal letter is drafted and sent to the Gentile churches. Agreement is reached. Everyone returns to their communities, a model of harmonious institutional decision-making. Now read Galatians chapter 2. Paul, writing at the time of the events, in his own words, describes a meeting in Jerusalem that shares the same rough setting, but reads completely differently. I went up by revelation, he writes. He says he met privately with the acknowledged leaders before presenting publicly. He describes the settlement in terms that sound like a negotiated territorial division. They would go to the circumcised, Paul and Barnabas to the Gentiles. Not a unified mission, a managed boundary between two movements that could not agree on the same terms. And then after the Jerusalem meeting, the Antioch confrontation, Peter arrives and eats with the Gentiles. Then men come from James, from Jerusalem, from the circumcision group, and Peter quietly, without announcement, withdraws. He moves to the Jewish table. Barnabas follows him. The community watches. Paul confronts Peter publicly, calls him out, uses the word kataginoskein, uses the word hypocrite, delivers the verdict. In Acts chapter 15 through 18, the Jerusalem Council. The Antioch confrontation is not there, not in a softened form, not as a passing reference to an earlier dispute, not as a footnote. It does not appear. Bart Ehrman, professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, whose Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene was published by Oxford University Press in 2006, is direct about what this means. He notes that we know of second-century Jewish followers of Jesus who held a highly negative view of Paul, maintaining that he had corrupted the original message of Christ. The communities that preserved those traditions had their reasons. Luke traveled with Paul. The book of Acts follows Paul's mission across Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor, Rome. It is not a neutral historical survey. It is the institutional narrative of the Pauline tradition. The official biography of the early church was written by the winning side's press secretary. The fight that determined who won was cut from the biography entirely. Think about that for a second. There is a second document, less known than Galatians, more specific in what it says. It is called the Epistula Petri, the letter of Peter to James. It is preserved in a body of texts known as the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies, second-century source material, transmitted by Syrian Christian communities over 1800 years. The question of whether this letter was written by the historical Peter is a separate scholarly discussion. What matters for our purposes is what the letter says, and who the communities that preserved it understood it to be written by and addressed to. Peter to James. For some among the Gentiles have rejected my lawful preaching and have preferred the lawless and foolish teaching of the hostile man. The hostile man. Peter never writes the name, he does not need to. The scholarly consensus on the identity of the hostile man has been stable since Ferdinand Christian Bauer at the University of Tübingen began systematically analyzing early church divisions in the 1840s. The hostile man is Paul. The lawless teaching that abandons the law is Paul's position. That is what Galatians 2 is about. That is what the Antioch confrontation is about. That is what the division between the Jerusalem tradition and the Pauline mission is about across every text that touches the question. Peter writes to James, "Someone is distorting my words. Someone is teaching Gentiles to abandon the law. I need you to know this. I found the Epistula Petri during research into early Jewish Christianity. I was working through the Pseudo-Clementine literature, looking for traces of the community that had stayed closest to the Jerusalem tradition after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. I read the passage twice. Then I sat there for a long time before I wrote anything. What stayed with me was not the identity of the hostile man. That is obvious once you know the context. What stayed with me was the address. Peter is not writing to Antioch. He is not writing to Rome. He is not writing to the Gentile churches at all. He is writing to James, the man who had been in the same house as Jesus for 30 years, the man who had sent the delegation to Antioch that caused everything to collapse, the man with the standing, in the original structure of the movement, to do something about what Peter was describing. The letter is, among other things, a request for reinforcement. Peter had lost the argument in Antioch. He had backed down when James's people arrived. Paul had convicted him publicly, and the hostility between the two movements had not resolved with the Jerusalem Council's diplomatic letter. Peter was writing to the one person who had the authority Peter himself had just demonstrated he lacked. He was asking for help. Antioch, 48 of the Common Era. Third largest city in the Roman Empire. A port city on the Orontes River in what is now southern Turkey. Mixed populations, former Jews, former pagans, Greeks, Syrians, Roman administrators, merchants from across the eastern Mediterranean. And in that city, one of the most radical communal experiments in the ancient world. A community where Jews and Gentiles were eating together at the same table. Shared bread, mixed seating, a table that declared there is no longer a distinction here. This was not a small thing. In first-century Jewish practice, the shared table was a theological statement. Who you ate with said who you were, who you considered ritually clean, who you considered your people. For uncircumcised Gentiles who did not keep the dietary laws to sit at that table alongside Torah-observant Jews was a rupture. For some, the most beautiful rupture imaginable. For others, something that could not hold. Peter arrives from Jerusalem. For weeks, he eats with the Gentiles. The mixed table is functioning. The experiment is working. Then a delegation arrives from James. From Jerusalem. From the original community. From the men who had known Jesus in Galilee. And Peter, without announcement, without a meeting or an explanation to the community, moves. He gets up from the Gentile table and sits with the Jewish group. Barnabas follows him. The community watches. Not with a confrontation, not yet. With a silence. The silence of a room that has just watched its bridge step off the bridge. And Paul, somewhere in that room watching it happen in real time, stands up. Ferdinand Christian Bauer was not the first person to notice that the early church contained divisions. He was the first person to prove it systematically, using the texts themselves as evidence. Working at the University of Tübingen in the 1840s, Bauer examined the Pauline letters and the Acts of the Apostles side by side. His conclusion was this: Acts presents the early church as a unified movement with complementary missions. The actual historical evidence, beginning with Paul's own letters, which predate any gospel, shows the early church was two competing movements wearing the same name: Petrine Christianity, Torah-observant, Jerusalem-based, continuous with the Jewish practice from which Jesus came and which his brother James led. Directed, in its original form, by men who had known Jesus personally, Pauline Christianity, law-free Gentile-facing, built on the Damascus vision and on a theology that declared the law abolished, accessible to the Roman world without requiring any prior connection to Judaism. Bauer's thesis was considered radical in 1845. It is now the foundation of historical critical study of early Christianity. The question he raised has not been answered. It has only been managed. L. Michael White, professor of classics and early Christianity at the University of Texas, whose From Jesus to Christianity was published by HarperCollins in 2004, is direct about what happened to Paul after Antioch. He writes, "The blow-up with Peter was a total failure of political bravado, and Paul soon left Antioch as persona non grata, never again to return." Never again to return. Paul's own letters confirm it. He never addresses the Antioch church after Galatians. He never references a return visit. The community that first called itself Christian, the city where the mixed table had almost worked, Paul left it after the confrontation with Peter. He built the rest of his mission from somewhere else. James D.G. Dunn, Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at the University of Durham, whose commentary on Galatians was published by Hendrickson in 1993, describes Peter as the bridge man between the two competing visions of early Christianity. The person with credibility on both sides. The person who could move between the Jerusalem tradition and the Pauline mission. The bridge chose James's table when James's people walked in, and Paul built the rest of the world from Antioch's ashes. You understand now why Acts does not mention what happened in Antioch, not because Luke was dishonest, not because he was a cynical propagandist inventing a myth. Luke was a writer with a purpose and an audience and a specific theological project to protect. The communities Paul had built across the Mediterranean needed a coherent narrative. They needed to know where they had come from. They needed Peter and Paul to be compatible. They needed the two foundational figures of the tradition to be partners in a unified mission. Because if they were opponents, If the foundation was a public rupture that was never resolved, if the two men left Antioch in opposite directions and stayed there, then everything built on top of that foundation carries the crack inside. Every papal decree that traces its authority to Peter's primacy, every Protestant soteriology that traces its theology to Paul's epistles, every moment when the church presents itself as a seamless tradition from Jesus to the present, passing through both men as through a single unbroken channel. If the channel was split from the beginning, the water has been coming from two different sources the whole time. And nobody in the official biography mentioned it. Read the silence. Acts chapter 15 ends in diplomatic consensus. Galatians chapter 2 ends with Paul delivering a public verdict against the man Matthew 16 calls the rock of the church. Same period, same dispute. Two incompatible accounts. One of them was written by the man who was there. The church eventually arrived at a solution. It is an elegant solution. I say that without contempt. Whatever else it is a piece of institutional architecture that has held for 17 centuries. Both men are declared co-founders of Rome, not representatives of competing theologies, not leaders of movements that publicly collapsed in Antioch. Co-founders, partners, both martyred under Nero in the mid-60s of the Common Era, buried in the same city, honored in adjacent basilicas, partners in death in marble and gold for 2,000 years. St. Peter's Basilica stands over what tradition identifies as Peter's burial site, the Basilica of St. Paul. Outside the walls stands on the road to Ostia. Two basilicas, one city. The two men whose fight in Antioch determined the theological shape of Western civilization, honored side by side. The historical evidence for Peter ever reaching Rome is thin. The evidence that he led a Roman church is thinner. The evidence that he was martyred there is plausible, but not definitive. The scholarly literature on Peter in Rome is careful and cautious, but the theological problem did not have another solution. Peter's primacy gave the Bishop of Rome his claim to authority over the universal church. You could not abandon Peter without dismantling the papacy's foundation. Paul's theology had become the doctrine. You could not abandon Paul without dismantling the soteriology, the Christology, the ecclesiastical architecture that had been in place since Constantine. The institution needed both men. It could not choose between them. It could not afford to acknowledge that they had chosen against each other. So it buried them in the same city, declared them partners in death, because it could not afford to acknowledge their opposition in life. The crack was covered in marble. The marble was beautiful. The crack did not go away. I want to tell you about a moment in a graduate seminar, second year, University of Southern Indiana. A professor, standing at the front of the room, asked the class a question. If you had to choose Peter's Christianity or Paul's Christianity, what would the world look like? 7 graduate students, fluorescent light, a radiator knocking in the corner of the room. Nobody answered, not for a long time. We had all been taught that the question was impossible, that Peter and Paul were the same tradition, that the early church's disagreements dissolved in consensus, that what came out of the first century was unified and coherent and intentional. We had been taught there was no choice to make. The professor held the silence. And in that silence, one by one, we all started doing the arithmetic. Peter's Christianity, Torah observant, continuous with the Judaism in which Jesus was formed, circumcision, dietary laws, Sabbath observance, a movement that required full conversion to Jewish practice before a Gentile could be considered part of the community, led by men who had been in the room with the historical Jesus and understood his teaching from the inside. No Roman church structured the way the Roman church structured itself. No papacy built on Petrine primacy, because Peter never left Jerusalem in this version. No empire-wide institution with the theological architecture Paul made possible. No crusades, no Inquisition. Also, no preservation of classical manuscripts through the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries. No hospitals built by religious orders across the medieval world. No cathedrals in Paris or Chartres or Cologne. No Bach cantatas written for Lutheran liturgy. No Notre Dame. Paul's Christianity, law-free, universalist, capable of crossing every linguistic and cultural boundary in the Roman world without requiring a prior connection to Judaism. capable of building institutions, writing systematic theology, organizing hierarchies that could survive the fall of empires and the conversion of kings. Also capable of what large, powerful institutions do to people who are inconvenient to them. J.J. Benitez has spent 40 years pointing toward a third option. He says in interviews documented across his career and preserved by the publishing house Planeta, the church is a consequence of a series of circumstances and the interests of the first disciples, but Jesus never thought of founding a church. That they later changed this and gave it meaning to Peter and to the institutional structure. His foundational observation across all 10 volumes of Kabbalah de Troia does not depend on the time travel premise of the series. It is a reading of the Synoptic Gospels that any reader can verify independently. The Jesus of the Beatitudes who said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek," was not describing Peter's Christianity. The Jesus of Luke 15, who told a story about a father running toward his son before the son had finished apologizing, was not describing Paul's. He was describing something that left no systematic letters, no 14 volumes of soteriology, no argument for the law or against it, no architecture of institutional authority, something that fit in a room with a closed door, or 2 or 3 people gathered, or a woman at a well in the middle of the day who had no institutional standing to receive what she received and received it anyway. Neither of the 2 men who fought in Antioch was describing that version. Both of them, in different ways, moved past it. And the third option is still in the text. In every Bible. Never suppressed, never placed on a restricted list, just sitting there on the same pages as everything built in its name. The professor held the silence in that seminar room until it became uncomfortable. Then he said, "The fact that none of you answered is itself an answer. That was 20 years ago. I have not managed to answer the question since. I'm not sure anyone has." Benitez spent 40 years on the historical Jesus. He said more than once in his later interviews that after everything he had found, the profile you encounter in the Synoptic Gospels and the profile you encounter in Paul's letters are not always describing the same person. He never resolved that. He documented it. The 2 apostles who fought in Antioch never resolved it either. They are buried under the same city, partners in death, the crack between them covered in marble since the 4th century. And the question from that seminar room is still open. If you had to choose, that's it, that's the question. This is Nathan, Forbidden Gospels.